the level in the well will go down.
Right.
The rate at which the well recovers its level is determined by the rate at which the water moves through the rock into the well.
That's clear.
That's the recharge rate, okay?
Okay, so that's what you're talking about.
And,
I call that the flow rate, but anyway.
A flow rate, yes. And it can vary enormously. I talk about the one under the Sahara is 2 inches a year, which is very slow. But you've got areas, say, in North Dakota, in that area, in the glacial rocks there, where the flow rate is equivalent to a small stream. 200 and more cubic feet per second recharge rate. And you hear people talking about underground rivers or flows. That's partly what they're talking about. Now, there are underground rivers. Of course, you see the Mammoth Caves and limestone formations. But they're talking about the water flowing through the rock under the ground.
Well, let me also clarify why I asked you the question about the aquifer and who has access to it.
Right.
Because I had heard a few years ago, I'm using this as an example, okay, that an oil well in Prudhoe Bay, which has enough oil to last 200 years, is not allowed to be used by anybody or any company in the United States. That oil is being sent to China. In that case, it's an oil example. But in this case, my question is similar. Is that happening with aquifers where an aquifer is found, and let's say the flow rate is better than 2 inches a year,
yeah.
But are they sequestered and then brought to other countries?
There are none that I know of. The only country in the world that I know of that is using aquifers to store water is Israel.
Okay.
And, of course, Israel, because of its strategic problems, determined a long time ago that it couldn't rely on the flow of water into the Jordan River from Syria and Lebanon. And so it considers only that water that is from the Sea of Galilee or Lake Kinneret or Lake Tiberias, depending on what historic time period you want to talk about. That's the only water that they can rely on. What they do is they extract water from their aquifers during the summer, and then during the winter, and we talked about deficit and surplus, in the winter when there's a surplus of water, they pump water down into the aquifer. They also pump primary treated sewage water into the aquifer because once that water's in the ground, it becomes purified by passing through the rock. That's the only country that I know of that is making a deliberate and active use of aquifers. In most countries, what happens is you simply have the aquifer and you tap into it and either just let people take whatever they want, or you control by limiting the number of wells that are allowed and the amount of water that people are allowed to take. Of course, during the drought of 88-89 in the western United States, which, by the way, meteorologically was worse than the 1930s drought, there was an argument that the irrigation farmers on the eastern side of the Rockies were taking out too much water that was causing the Ogallala Aquifer water table to drop. In fact, it was the drought that was causing the drop because the amount of water the farmers were taking out was negligible relative to the total quantity of water in it. But to get back to your oil example, one of the problems that you have is those aquifers don't respect national boundaries. Also with oil, one of the problems they've had in the last several years is that they've developed the techniques of drilling down and then drilling sideways. So you could have a land claim on the surface and say, well, I'm going to drill for oil there, and you could go down and then drill sideways into somebody else's oil reserve. Well, certainly that's a possibility with water. And so we get back into that problem of jurisdiction, the distribution of the resource, who has control over the resource, and that, of course, is what the whole NAFTA thing was about. That basically what you were saying was that not only trade, but resources in any of the countries had to be priced and shared equitably across the borders. Now, just to give you an example of where that becomes problematic, is that in the city of Winnipeg, in the center of Canada, they pay about $2.10 for 1,000 gallons of water. Well, when you consider what you can get for a bottle of water in Phoenix, Arizona, and you consider that the average water bill in parts of Florida is $300 a month, You can see why, when I was appointed to a water commission in Manitoba, I suggested to the minister that I would be far better off buying up old milk trucks, filling them with water, and trucking them down to Florida or to Phoenix, because I could fill it up for about $10 and get $2 a gallon for it down in those locations. This is the difficulty. It's the distribution of the water, but it's also in terms of who has access to it, what price can you charge for it. Now, to give you another illustration of the difficulty with NAFTA with regard to the water, I proposed to the Manitoba government that in order to offset cheap labor in Mexico, Manitoba could attract industry by offering cheap water and cheap power, because hydroelectric power is very cheap and easy to produce. And of course, that was fine until NAFTA came in. Once NAFTA came in, we couldn't do that, because if we use the water as an enticement to industry at a cheap rate, we then had to sell that water to the U.S. or Mexico at the same price. So in other words, the trade idea sounds all very nice on the surface or even underground, but the ramifications of it, the implications of it are so far-reaching. I already made the argument about the two negotiators at the table. Now, the other issue, Kim, is that people say, well, I've read the NAFTA agreement and it hardly mentions water. My experience is that it's the things that the politicians don't talk about that you need to worry about. The mechanisms for the transfer of water are built into the NAFTA agreement. For example, you're not likely to see river diversions, that there's environmental opposition to that kind of thing, and we've seen some of that with attempts to divert a river in North Dakota into the Red River, and that's crossing from one water basin into another, and there was complaints about pollution and mixing of species and so on. But what you will see, and I've been involved in this, in fact, about 20 years ago, I was approached to do some climate studies on the potential for water pipelines. And of course, pipelines are under the section in the NAFTA agreement of bulk carrier. That's a general category that is covered under the NAFTA and says that you cannot block or impede any bulk carrier. Now, that's an interesting issue with regard to the current dispute over the natural gas pipeline.
You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the Telecommunications Act in the United States that talks about that they can put up as many microwave stations, but they don't mention microwave. They talk about telecommunications technology, and they're answerable to nobody, even if it impairs their health. It's all the way it's languaged.
Yes, and by the way, pipelines to carry water, there have been lots of examples of them. I mean, the Romans with their aqueducts were essentially that, because they were a covered system. In a lot of rural areas across the western North America, there are municipal water pipelines where a group of people get together and tap into a source and share the cost of distributing that water. What we're talking about, of course, is pipelines on a continental scale. That's really the mechanism that would be used. There are other schemes. For example, the state of Alaska has proposed a water pipeline running down the west coast to provide water into Southern California. And of course, they argue that this wouldn't cause any environmental damage, because if a water pipeline breaks, it's not like oil or anything else. So that's been on the books for some time. The pipeline category is the mechanism by which you would transfer this water around the continent. The other portion of it is that in the NAFTA agreement, there is a section for commodities. Now, they define a commodity as, say, something that has a unit price, so that oil or gas, and that the NAFTA says that if Canadians have oil and gas at a certain price, they must then sell it to America at the same price. Okay? And one of the great frustrations for Canadians is that so much of the oil and gas Americans are burning is coming from Canada, but your gasoline is at a lower rate than ours. I'm paying right now $1.32 a liter for gasoline, which works out, you can multiply that by 4, so I'm paying over $5 a gallon for gasoline in a country that has some of the greatest oil reserves in the world. But this is the insanity of all of these things. So the commodities price says that if something has a unit price, then you must trade it across the border at the same price. you can't exploit another nation for that commodity. Well, water is rapidly becoming a commodity. I mentioned the thing about Winnipeg, where they're paying just over $2 for 1,000 gallons. Well, it isn't going to be long before, and in